Welcome back on Oncology for the Inquisitive Mind, where we're about to break something. I don't know. There's lots of breaking. Break wind, code break water. But we are still in the world of colorectal cancer, and nothing is being broken, but there are really interesting trials coming out looking at targeted therapy, which is what you need, because chemotherapy, it's great. It's a sledgehammer. Doesn't work for anyone. The Holy Grail is out there. So if you as a researcher can find it, let us know. Shoot us an email at inquisitiveonc.com if you think there's anything interesting we should talk about, and give us 5 stars. Michael, I'm accompanied by my beautiful, incredibly conscientious co-host, Dr. Michael Fernando. Michael, you might need a haircut soon. I've had a recent one, and check that out on YouTube. But how are you today?
I'm good, and you hit the nail on the head. I'm getting a haircut later today. Eloquent was the word of the day last week. Is conscientious going to be the word of the day this week?
I think so. You're a good conscientious man. But Michael,
today's episode is brought to you by the word conscientious and the letter B.
Would it be letter C?
Whatever.
Conscientious. Or also break, or maybe letter B. Michael, I think I'm the one watching more Play School than you. I'm not Play School Sesame Street than you.
Or both. Yeah.
Or both. Michael, let's just start. Let's just go and talk about colorectal cancer.
I do love derailing your intros sometimes, I must say. But yes, colorectal cancer, much to Josh's chagrin, we are still talking about it. But we are talking about some of the more exciting developments in the past few years. Now, last week, we talked about dMMR colorectal cancer, where immunotherapy had shown its face again and demonstrated significant benefits, whether it's Ipi-Nivo or Pembro. This week, we're going to be talking about the 2 most common mutations, not HER2, even though Josh really wants to do HER2, and we'll do that next week, I think. But we are talking about KRAS and my study, the BREAKWATER study. We are talking about BRAF, specifically the BRAFV600E mutation, which accounts for approximately 8 to 12% of metastatic colorectal cancers. And BRAF to colorectal cancer is sort of like triple negative to breast cancer. Or I'm trying to think of another equivalent. Nope, that's all I got.
Bad cancer.
Yeah, it's bad cancer.
Yeah.
Bad. Well, find me a good cancer, Josh.
No, but like it's cancer that's resistant, inherently resistant, that you're going to do poor with prognosis. It's like, yeah.
Indeed. And it is historically been a prognostic rather than a therapeutic target. And a big part of that comes from data as early as 2014. Now, for those who are watching on YouTube, you will be able to see I've got a single but very illuminating study from a retrospective cohort analysis by Tran and colleagues that was published in 2011. And this is the average overall survival, the median overall survival for patients with BRAF wild type compared to BRAF mutant. For those of you who can't see this, the difference is a staggering 24 months. So 2 years worth of survival difference between these 2 cohorts, 34.7 compared to 10.4 months. So that really tells you all you need to know.
It's terrible.
It's terrible. It is the triple negative cancer of colorectal cancer.
Now, and that's before neoadjuvant chemo, neoadjuvant immunotherapy in triple negative breast cancer.
Yeah, so, yes. we don't have that in colorectal cancer, unfortunately.
Not yet.
Now, fortunately, there has been some progress in this area. So the Beacon colorectal cancer study, Josh is looking like an evil genius over there. The Beacon colorectal cancer study demonstrated the benefit of encorafenib and cetuximab, but not a triplet that included binimetinib, over a dealer's choice of chemotherapy in the second line and further treatment of BRAF mutant colorectal cancer. And we've talked about that in the past. However, we're not talking about it today because it has been superseded. It has been made redundant by BREAKWATER, because BREAKWATER moves the cetuximab combination into the first line and combines it with chemotherapy. The chemotherapy is investigator's choice of FOLFOX, FOLFOXIRI, or CAPOX. So patients were randomly assigned 1-to-1 to receive chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy in the form of FOLFOX plus encorafenib and cetuximab. And there was a third arm, and the reason I'm mentioning it, it was closed early. As you can see from this from the diagram, there are fewer patients in the encorafenib and cetuximab alone arm, which is a very interesting exploratory arm, completely cutting out chemo from the equation entirely, which is the holy grail, as Josh likes to say very frequently. But this arm, unfortunately, was stopped early due to concerns about safety. We'll come back to that. So the co-primary endpoints of the study were overall response rate and progression-free survival. The key secondary endpoint was overall survival, and other secondary endpoints included the time to response, duration of response, PFS2, patient-reported outcomes, and safety. Interestingly, the trial excluded patients who were also deficient in MMR, and deficient MMR, which we talked about last week, and BRAF mutant patients, they do sometimes go hand in hand. So figures that I've found somewhere, and these will vary, of course, depending on where you read, but approximately 30% of patients with BRAF mutant colorectal cancer also have MSI high disease. So that cohort of patients are not covered in this study. Very important. And if you did have a BRAF mutant deficient MMR colorectal cancer patient, you'd give them immunotherapy in the first line anyway, which is the reason they excluded them. Now, a couple of demographic notes. Almost all patients were either white or Asian. Again, we've spoken about this very frequently, but people of African-American ethnicity were significantly underrepresented in this study. About 60% of patients had right-sided disease, 77 I should say, had de novo metastatic disease, and 60% had liver mets. Interestingly, and it's a very small number, but I think it's worth saying that despite this being a BRAF targeted study, between 2 and 6% of patients did not have available BRAF mutation status across the three arms. And again, I think it's interesting. It does highlight that even a well-run study like this, you can't get everyone. There are going to be hiccups. There are going to be errors in terms of data collection or mutation assay running, and it's important that those errors be acknowledged so they can be picked apart by armchair statisticians and oncologists like us.
Keyboard warriors.
Keyboard warriors.
Yes. Keyboard warrior of the day.
Yes, exactly. Now, here we have the first most pertinent set of results, which is the progression-free survival, the primary endpoint. And this is, it includes all three arms. And you can see that the EC alone arm, which is there in orange, was equivalent to the standard of care. But the combination of FOLFOX and encorafenib cetuximab was significantly superior, 12.8 months compared to 7.1 months, with a hazard ratio of 0.53, which, as I said, was statistically significant. And you can see at the bottom there that the benefit was consistent across all subgroups. This is one of those forest plots that you don't have to have too many provisos, too many caveats, because everything is shifted beautifully to the left there. Interestingly, the median PFS for EC alone was 6.8 months, again, slightly less than the standard of care chemotherapy. But this is where it gets really interesting and really cool. So overall survival. The combination, 30.3 months, and amazingly for BRAF mutant colorectal cancer, the upper limit was not reached. This is compared to 15.1 months with standard of care with a hazard ratio of 0.49. Now, for those of you who have the charts in front of you, who have the Kaplan-Meier curves in front of you, look at where EC is. EC by itself, the median overall survival for EC monotherapy was better numerically because, they stopped it early. They didn't subject this to statistical rigor. But EC alone, the survival was better at 19.5 months compared to chemotherapy alone, which is amazing. Coming back to the two arms that they did compare, 24-month overall survival was 52% compared to 29%, and the benefit was again consistent across all subgroups. Now, this is an interim analysis. It will be very interesting to see what the real or the actual overall survival is for the combination. But the benefit is there and it is clear for all to see. Now, they also did PFS2 data and talked about subsequent systemic anti-cancer treatments. And you will see when you delve into the supplementary analysis, we love a supplementary analysis on this show, but you'll see that 41% of patients in the standard of care arm got a BRAF inhibitor or a combination. So that would be, going on to the Beacon regimen. And despite that, you still have the benefit of overall survival. And we talked about this in the episode last week in terms of the importance of PFS2 and sequencing. The PFS2 was still better despite almost half of patients in the standard of care arm getting BRAF inhibition was better for EC plus the chemo upfront. 20.7 compared to 12.7 months. So the sequence in this situation is very clear. And it goes back to something that I heard our recent guest Jenny Seligman talk about, is that the evidence is that if you have a good treatment for this high-risk group of patients, you put it first, because not only is it just better to do it first, to put your best treatment first, but it also has knock-on effects where there's no such thing in oncology as saving treatment. In terms of overall response rate, that was, again, better, 65.7 compared to 37.4. Again, EC monotherapy coming there in the middle, 45.6%, so better than chemotherapy alone. In terms of safety, there were similar rates of toxicity across the two groups. There were more common. The more common adverse events in the combination group included things like arthralgias, anemias, and decreased appetite and vomiting. There were small but significant rates of intestinal obstruction, ileus, that sort of thing in the combination group. Interestingly, no data on things like headaches or new primary skin cancers, which is something that the melanoma guys will say you've got to watch out for with BRAF and I think BRAF and MEK inhibitors, but BRAF inhibitors by themselves specifically. But there was no data in this study. So a massive win, in summary, a massive win for the combination of FOLFOX, encorafenib, and cetuximab. And it, in areas where things are a bit less regulated, shall we say, this is already the first line standard of care for this group of patients. I'm hoping that it will come to Australia pretty quickly because we've already got the approval for second line. Simple, you take that, you chuck it in the bin, and then you move it into the first line. So there shouldn't be a significant increase to the health economic considerations. But a brilliant study, and I think that the really interesting part of this, and it's obviously not something that you can take to the bank, but is the EC alone. And I think that if you have a patient who has really bad toxicity from the chemotherapy backbone and the combination, or has contraindications, say previous coronary artery vasospasm or DYPD deficiency or severe peripheral neuropathy, you can feel reasonably comfortable, shall we say, in reducing or eliminating the chemotherapy backbone. And be confident that giving chemotherapy by itself versus giving EC by itself, the money is with the EC rather than the chemotherapy. And that's Breakwater.
Michael, I think you broke the internet with your incredible explanation there.
I certainly verbally broke wind.
You broke wind, hopefully not the other kind of wind. No. Michael, there is another break to chat about before you and I take a break from recording, which is the CODEBREAK 300 trial. And I think I might have got the slightly poorer cousin of these two trials.
I just really wanted to talk about Breakwater. I'm sorry. It excites me. We talked about last week. A long study makes you happy, but a good study like Breakwater makes me happy.
Well, me too. I mean, I think I did Beacon last time. We kind of delved into this a couple of years back. So it's nice to share some wins with you as well. So I'm talking about the KRAS cohort of patients. KRAS, you might be hearing it in lung cancer. There's lots of trials going on. There's approvals going on. It's exciting. But there's also that cohort of patients in colorectal cancer who have a KRAS mutation. I'll give you a bit of the background and then we'll go into the trial. So KRAS, which is the Kristen rat sarcoma viral oncogene homolog, which is a glycine to cysteine mutation of the codon 12, everybody. So you should all remember that off the top of your head right now. It's a driver mutation and it affects 4% of patients. So you've now got, Michael, what was it was what, 10% of patients have your mutation?
Between 8 and 12, yeah, but
okay, about 10%. So you've got
4% sounds quite low for KRAS, unless it's G12C only.
It's G12C because there's a huge number of KRAS mutations, but we just don't have targets for them. But if you got the 12% from Michael's trial, the 4% from this trial, the approximately 10% of the DMMR, you're doing not badly. It's like a good 20 to 25% of patients who have a targetable mutation in the first line. And they say could be a poor prognosis indicator as well. So patients that are refractory to fluorouracil with Bev and standard of care later line therapies like Lonsurf and regorafenib, that's sort of what this trial is looking at. At the time of printing of this trial, there was no targeted therapies by biomarker approved in the KRAS setting. Enter sotorasib or sotorasib, however you'd like to pronounce it. I've probably done it wrong. Michael, feel free to correct me.
I genuinely don't know. Like,
Great.
I've in the immortal words of Sean Spencer from the hit TV show Psych, I've heard it both ways.
Great. So this drug, along with adagrasib, has shown improvement in lung cancer, limited efficacy in the colorectal cancer. There's resistance, right? So all of these kind of downstream mechanisms have upstream activation, and then you essentially lose the benefit of this drug. So that's EGFR pathways. They work synergistically, and inhibiting both of these targets in preclinical models had really promising outcomes. Dual blockade! In capital letters. It was designed to overcome the resistance. It was the CODEBREAK 101 trial. It was a phase 1B. They showed a response rate of about 30%. So not bad versus 9% in monotherapy. Curious, right? It's very curious. Enter the international phase 3 CODEBREAK 300 trial. The reigning champion, maybe not the reigning champion, but we'll look at it anyway. So the trial was a 3-arm trial, and let me bring it up for everyone to sort of have a look, especially you, Michael, so we can compare the pair. This is the trial. And the trial has 3 arms. So you had to be over 18. You had to have a KRAS G12C mutation, which is done through molecular testing. You can't just guess and say, hey, I've got a KRAS G12C mutation.
Imagine if you could. I'm sorry. Imagine if you could just, oh, yeah. I mean, you look like someone who has a KRAS G12C mutation.
Your nose looks interesting. It's definitely a KRAS G12C.
You can say that. I cannot. I'm not touching that.
So you'd have to have more than one line of therapy in the metastatic colorectal cancer after fluoropyrimidine, which is, of course, important, irinotecan and oxaliplatin, an ECOG of less than or equal to 2. You will then randomize 1 to 1 to 1. So this was back when the American government they're still pushing it, like look at proper dosing of patients rather than just the biggest dose, right? Because maybe you can get the same outcome at the lower dose and less toxicity. So you had 960 milligrams of sotorasib plus panitumumab, cetuximab's cousin, sotorasib plus panitumumab at a lower dose, and then investigator choice, which was Lonsurf, which is trifluridine and tipiracil or regorafenib as your kind of control arm. Primary endpoint, progression-free survival, and your secondary endpoint being that of overall survival and objective response rate. Moving on to the demographics, I don't think it was actually that well balanced. What I found is that 50%, like there was a higher cohort of patients that were over the age of 65 in the higher sotorasib arm, and versus, let's say, 50% in standard of care. They said it was equalized, but I'm like 15% I feel is just a bit outside that, especially in a small trial. And there was a very small portion that had EGOG2 as well. So this was generally a relatively robust cohort of patients. Prior lines of therapy, about 13 to 16% had sort of 1 prior line, 2 lines of therapy, about 85% within all the arms. Over 90% had exposure to oxaliplatin, prior exposure to Lonsurf in about 13% of patients, and prior exposure to regorafenib less than 7%.
Which is interesting in and of itself, given that regorafenib or Lonsurf are the comparator arms, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you do have this is across all three arms, of course, but you do have a comparator or a small proportion of patients who are basically just getting treatment that they've already had, and famously does not work very well.
Yeah, well, and it was against best supportive care as well, so that's sort of
that's the line that we're in.
Yep. So recruited 2022 to 2023, so rough within that COVID. Well, in Melbourne, in the COVID, the rest of the world potentially less COVID-y. There are 219 patients screened, about 50 patients in the higher dose of sotorasib, 50 patients in the lower dose of sotorasib, and the rest standard of care. So that's pretty even. The median progression-free survival in the first analysis was 5.6 months for the higher dose versus 3.9 months for the lower dose and 2 months in the standard of care, which is somewhat in keeping. The hazard ratio for that was 0.005 for the higher dose, and for the lower dose was 0.59. So both of these dosings were versus standard of care. So they won't verse each other, just to clarify that point. Tumor response rates also interesting, about 26% in the higher sotorasib arm, 5% in the lower sotorasib arm, and I'm pretty sure it was 0% in the standard of care. So you got disease control, but nothing better. And Michael, while your sub-analysis was quite nice in the context of having everything to the left of, quote unquote, the drug being better, mine was slightly less nice. So I'll share that now for our YouTube viewers. And as you can see on the thing, it's sort of a lot of the time it did cross that sort of confidence interval. But overall, we did see a benefit for the progression-free survival patients. And so that's promising. We're at a point in the discussion here where it's promising. You look at complete response. You actually had people in the higher dose that had a complete response. Only 2%. I appreciate that's sort of one patient, but you still see a partial response 24% and stable disease in about 45%. Your disease control rate was about 30% better in patients who had sotorasib versus standard of care. That's the important thing. So about 46 versus 71. And median duration of response was 4.4 months versus in the higher level of sotorasib. So the overall survival was not mature at this first. And then the thing I want to focus on here was actually adverse events. So while lots of people had adverse events, overall grade 3 or higher was better than standard of care, which you rarely get in trials. So it was 35% in the higher dose of sotorasib, 30% in the lower dose, and 43% in the standard of care. The main adverse events for this drug, so the KRAS inhibitor, low magnesium, cool, we'll give you an infusion. Great. Rash, probably from the panitumumab, I'm guessing, and dermatitis acneiform. Right? So they were the three main ones. Mostly pretty manageable, I'd find. And the standard of care, as expected, neutropenia and nausea, which can be quite debilitating. So can a rash. So at this point of time, we're waiting on overall survival. As my notes say, what about overall survival? So the overall survival at the point in time, there were 82 deaths, only 150 patients in this trial. The hazard ratio was 0.7 for the high dose, but it was not statistically significant. And at the lower dose, it was 0.83, still not statistically significant. And that lower dose was a descriptive analysis either. So the median overall survival was not reached in the high dose and 11.9 months in the lower dose and 10.3 months in the investigated choice. So there was a trend in the higher dose and it was consistent with the intention to treat, but it was not statistically significant. That 18-month overall survival mark was 50% in the 960 milligrams of sotorasib versus 35% in the standard of care arm. And while median progression-free survival maintained is statistical significant, there are some issues, right? The issue being no having overall survival, but there was also crossover permitted outside the trial. So maybe this has influenced it. And that's sort of hard to say. It wasn't included in the direct trial. So, and probably wasn't powered for it. So 27.8% in the control arm moved to an anti-EGFR and KRAS inhibitor after the trial. So did that influence? Potentially. There was an ad hoc analysis looking for confounders, and it had a hazard ratio of 0.65 in the higher sotorasib arm. And objective response rate was still markedly better in this cohort of patients. So how do you actually put this all together? We've got a third-line drug, probably a third-line drug or earlier second-line drug that has progression-free survival but no overall survival and a better toxicity profile. So I was doing some reading over this, and this is what I sort of have summarized. If the person is not a candidate for a trial, or there's no other targetable mutations that have better evidence, then you can use this combination. Because you're not losing anything. There is definitely a numerical benefit, and there probably would be a statistical benefit if the trial design was slightly different, I'd guess. But you'd still be able to say, hey, you can get a better outcome with less toxicity in this cohort of patients. Or they go on a trial. There's also fruquintinib, which wasn't compared in this cohort of patients, which has come on later to, TGA, FDA, all of the sort of approval market. So there's that. The other thing, there's also some other drugs, like what about cetuximab or adagrasib? So they actually did do an early non-comparative trial called the Crystal 1 study, Michael. And objective response rate was pretty similar, about 34%, but their median progression-free survival and overall survival was less, of about 7 and 16 months, respectively. And grade 3 to grade 4 tox was about 28%. So I guess we can probably say it's somewhat similar and comparative between these two cohorts of drugs. But, if you want a phase 3 trial, then you're going to go with the CodeBreak 300 trial that I've just described. But I think the summary is a treatment option. Sad that we don't have statistical overall survival benefit, but there is a numerical benefit.
I guess the main question in terms of future directions, because, I agree, it's sort of a lukewarm recommendation there, isn't it, Josh, based on the study?
It's lukewarm, but also, you know what, when you give someone Lonsurf and they just don't do well.
They don't do well, no. And, there's so many factors that go into that. But I guess the question is, could you see, based on your reading, based on sort of the toxicity profile, someone doing a breakwater type study where they combine this with chemotherapy in the second line or even the first line?
Oh, that was actually going to be my next comment. So thank you for ruining my one interesting comment, my one interesting brain thought on the brain. Look, I think it'd be an interesting one because the toxicity is better than Lonsurf. You'd probably have to be careful. But it's sort of a bit like, some of these drug combinations do work, like your trial work better when you combine it with chemotherapy.
And also works better, as I said, when you move it up the
chain.
Up the ladder, up the chain.
The question is, are they willing to put the money in to kind of do an earlier study that might not be beneficial? Unknown at this stage. But look, I still think it's an option for your patients. Yeah. And I think, yes, you can say lukewarm, but it's not like there's something that's superior if you have no other mutations.
No, and you always prefer the targeted mutation to the napalm, or the targeted treatment to the napalm treatment.
Exactly. Well, Michael, that was a bit of a whirlwind, but we've got to do some more colorectal. I feel we can't be done.
No, you're very true.
Thank goodness.
And this is not on our schedule, so this is the first time Josh is hearing this as well. But next week we're going to be talking more about mutations, and at Josh's great and persistent insistence, we're going to be talking about HER2, mutant colorectal cancer, because it is very interesting.
Antibody drug conjugates, yes, please.
Yes. We love an ADC on this show. We're also going to be talking about a population of patients with PIK3 kinase inhibitors, or PIK3 kinase mutations, I should say. And I said PIK3 kinase inhibitors, but the medication under examination is actually humble, plain old aspirin. So on that cliffhanger, we'll see you next week.
We'll aspire to give you a great trial.
Exactly.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Oncology for the Inquisitive Mind, produced by ADC Productions with the assistance of education grants from Pfizer and Merck Pharmaceuticals. As always, these companies do not receive early previews or editorial input of any kind. The opinions expressed in this episode are our own, and the facts are, well, the facts. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing to be among the first to hear our latest forays into the ever-changing world of medical oncology. You can find previous episodes of our show, including coverage of major conferences, interviews with world-renowned experts, and much more, at inquisitiveonc.com. If you would like a particular subject covered on the show, drop us a line at inquisitiveonc@gmail.com, And if you happen to be in Australia, stay tuned for details about exciting in-person events we have planned for the near future. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to demystifying oncology again next time.